How's everything?
Como siempre, thank you. Catherine, did you meet Margarita? Not really. Margarita López Maya, Capriles, una investigadora muy destacada que está trabajando.
What's the order?
En ese orden.
Dice Margarita.
Carlos, después de yo tú vas.
Ok.
Margarita.
Primero Carlos,
Es
después
tuyo.
Margarita y yo al final.
Okay. You want it over there now?
I've got
Oh,
this.
you have the. Okay.
¿Quieres agua?
Okay, gracias.
¿Te sirvo agua, Margarita? ¿Quieres agua?
All right.
Good morning. If everyone could please take a seat, we'll get started. My name is Cindy Arnson. I'm director of the. Can people hear me? Is this on? I think it is. No? Let's see. Is Veronica here? Somebody. Let's see if we can get the microphones a little higher. Anyway, I'm Cindy Arnson, director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. A pleasure to welcome you and also to welcome from the region Margarita Lopez Maya, former fellow Carlos de la Torre from University of Kentucky by way of Ecuador, Hector Sheamus of Georgetown University, originally from Argentina, to this panel. It is the belated celebration of the publication of this book, Latin American Populism in the 21st Century. And I think the discussion of the book is particularly relevant in light of what's taking place right now in Venezuela. We know the basic facts. There are street mobilizations in Venezuela on a daily basis. They perhaps lack the magnitude of the Caracazo of 1989, but they represent the most sustained outpouring of protest against the government since Hugo Chavez took power in 1998. About 40 people have been killed. Some of them government agents or supporters, but the majority of them government opponents and students who have been gunned down by members of the National Guard and by colectivos, the armed civilian militias that support the government. Scores of protesters remain jailed. There are credible reports of torture. The prominent opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, remains in prison, the former mayor of a Caracas suburb. 2 other mayors from opposition strongholds are also in jail. Another prominent opposition politician, Maria Corina Machado, has been stripped of her seat in the National Assembly, and Chavista leaders have launched a criminal investigation into her activities while she was here briefly in March of this year. How did Venezuela get to this point? The inflation rate 57% is the third highest in the world after Belarus and South Sudan. Despite the government programs that have dramatically reduced poverty and inequality, shortages of basic consumer goods are rampant, and cities are plagued by frequent cuts of electricity and water. Even after modifications in the currency system last month, the parallel exchange rate is still 8 times the official rate of 6.3 bolivars to the dollar. In addition to its crumbling economy, Venezuela has the highest rate of homicide in all of South America, and indeed one of the highest in the world. The protests in Venezuela and the levels of polarization in the country reflect a deeper structural problem rooted in dramatically contrasting notions of democracy and governance. And understanding this problem requires unpacking the nature of populism in Latin America and its most radical manifestations. I'd like to turn the microphone to Carlos de la Torre, who will describe some of the manifestations of 21st century radical populism, speak briefly about Ecuador, and then we'll go to the main course, which is Margarita Lopez Maya, followed by Hector. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Is the mic on? Thanks, Cindy. It's a pleasure to be here. Populism is a discourse and a political strategy to get to power and to govern based on the democratized demand to return power to its original owners, the people. But as soon as we hear the name the people, this mythical word, the people, religious-like images and theological conceptions of politics could appear in the horizon. The transformation of the term the people into a liberating subject cautions us how in its name alleged enemies of the people have been invented. Constructed as external others, these enemies can be illegal aliens, as in Europe, or the evil oligarchy in Latin America. And they are the threat, they are represented as a threat to the purity of the homogeneous body of the people. Claiming to incarnate the people, populist leaders might be tempted to stay in power forever, like Chavez tried in Venezuela but couldn't because he got ill. And Correa might do that in Ecuador because there is nothing but Correa in his citizens' revolution. Alternatively, and this is important about the word the word of the people or the name of the people can be invoked in order to say enough to injustices and oppressions. Like Llanos, the people has two faces. Scholars see it as a danger to democracy or as the foundation of democratic regimes. Similarly, populism is fear or praise by scholars. Some very prominent political scientists like Kurt Weyland recently and Steve Levitsky argue that populism leads to authoritarianism. Other prominent scholars like Ernesto Laclau see in populism a promise for the democratic regeneration of ostracized and exclusionary political systems. Our book, Latin American Populism in the 21st Century, co-edited with Cindy, analyzes and deals on how scholars have dealt with the relationships of populism and democracy since populism started in the region in the 1930s and 40s. We argue that populism is an inclusionary attempt to fulfill democratic promises and demands, but populism might undermine pluralism and the freedoms that make a democracy possible. To understand the current wave of populism, we have to see that they are inheritors of a long-lasting tradition in Latin America, and it's associated with names such as Eva and Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina, Getulio Vargas in Brazil, Víctor Raúl Laya de la Torre in Peru, José María Velasco Ibarra in Ecuador, and these figures still are remembered either as demagogues or as people who brought the fundamental democratizations of their societies. Under their leadership, previously excluded people were incorporated into the national community, and they acquired mythical status. Leslie Bethel, in his very interesting chapter on Brazil, quotes the following parts of Getulio Vargas' suicide letter. And Getulio said that he was always, and I quote, a slave of the people. He said that he returned to power in 1950-51 in the arms of the people, nos brazos do povo, and that he has sought to defend the people, and particularly the very poor, against powerful interests. Now, old and tired, he was, and this is a quote, serenely taking the first road to eternity, living life to enter history. The way in which these populists perceive themselves is not very light, right? They are making history. At the same time that populists were democratizing their societies, incorporating people, redistributing income, incorporating symbolically those who are excluded in everyday life, they were also staying in power, considering that they are above the existing institutions of civil society and above constitutions. Now, going to the new wave of radical populism, when Chavez, Morales, and Correa were elected, there was a big crisis of political representation in their nations. And that is very important to start with that fact. And second, while in power, these presidents contribute to further erode political parties. Now, these governments are refounding the nation, right? They are not just any old regular president elected for a period of time. On the contrary, these leaders have a mission, and their mission is linked to the feats of the independence movement in Latin America. They are leading Latin America, they are leading their nations to the second and real independence, and they are refounding the nation. Chavez was leading, and Maduro is leading a Bolivarian revolution. Morales is leading a post-colonial democratic revolution to empower indigenous people, and Rafael Correa is supposed to be leading a citizens' revolution. These revolutions are done with votes and not with bullets. Differently from the left that went to the mountains, the idea is to win elections and to be in permanent electoral campaigns in order to displace the hegemonic power of traditional political elites, consolidate their power, and elections tend to be clean, except the election of Maduro. But all of the other elections, the process of voting is clean. The electoral process has been very skewed because the opposition has not had the same privilege as the incumbent. These revolutions are done in the name of substantive projects of democratization. For Correa, democracy lies in social justice. I don't know if any of you read Correa's letter to the Boston Globe 2 days ago. He's a Democrat because he's bringing social justice. And anybody who's opposing him is nothing but a servant of the old oligarchy. And not only that, he says that he has been 7 years in power, governing by and for the people. Correa is the people, there's no doubt about it. Some of these governments have created experiments of participatory democracy at the local level. Venezuela, I think, is a very interesting case in terms of that. In Bolivia, you also have experiments of participation at the local level. In Ecuador, the government is ruling from the top down, and the only time in which people get asked to do anything is to go and vote in all of these permanent elections that Correa has been calling about. New constitutions were drafted, and the idea was to create a new institutional order. I mean, here populism is not only destroying the existing institutions, it's also creating a new institutional order, and this new institutional order is meant to empower and to incorporate the excluded people. And this new institutional order is characterized by a concentration of power in the executive and the idea of majoritarian mobilization by a leader, that it's much more important than the check and balances and the respect for basic civil rights that are inherent in a liberal democracy. All of these revolutions have a statist view. I mean, they are very state-oriented. It's not only that the state has to play a bigger role in the economy or that the state has to be in charge of bringing social justice and the redistribution of income. The state also has to control the flow of information. The state has, and it's very interesting how they tend to see themselves as these technocrats, especially I'm thinking about the people around Garcia Linera or the people who work for Rafael Correa in Ecuador. You have all these technocrats that are post-neoliberal. They are not linked to the International Monetary Fund. On the contrary, they come from academia and NGO, but they consider they can represent the interests of the nation as a whole, and not particular interests of special interest groups such as unions, such as teachers groups, etc., etc. Finally, the notion of national sovereignty is very important in these revolutions. And not only that, they consider themselves to be part of a continental and even a world movement of wresting hegemony to the United States. Chavez used to say Latin America is at the vanguard of the world, And Morales said, we want Bolivia with its political, economic, cultural, and ecological proposals to be a hope for the entire world. In our book, we look at different theoretical aspects of the relationship of populism with democracy, with political systems, social policy, and we also have case studies, and today we're lucky to have Margarita and Hector who will talk about Venezuela and Argentina. I want to talk very briefly about Correa, because when Correa won his third election in 2013 with 57% of the vote, Ecuador went from being a very unstable country to a country that might be ruled by the same person, because Correa now is perhaps seeking to be re-elected again. What is unique of Correa? I think that what is unique of Correa is that he combines in his persona the populist and the technocrat. He has a PhD in economics, and every Saturday in his Enlaces Ciudadanos, in his TV shows, he talks like a professor of the nation. He lectures to Ecuadorians, how to reach modernity, even hyper-modernity, because we're supposedly changing the productive matrix of Ecuador, and we will be exporting nanotechnology. We're going to be exporting software by the year 2030. So he's the teacher, he's teaching us. Of course, he's a traditional teacher because he talks, everybody takes notes. But he's also the populist. He uses a Manichaean discourse to trash his enemies, to trash his adversaries as enemies of the nation. He's in war against the privately owned media. His idea is that the media has this very strong capacity to create hegemony. He has this reading of the media and the media, according to him and his advisors, is able to construct hegemony. So what do we have to do? We have to have a counter-hegemonic media. So they created a state-led media, and they have regulated the contents of the media by the state, and they don't see that there are any problems with that, because the state nowadays is under these young technocrats who can represent the interests of society as a whole and not the special interest groups. All existing institutions were considered to be corrupt, that have to be renewed. And it's very interesting that Correa is in war not only against the privately owned media, but against social movements. There are 200 indigenous and peasant leaders who have been accused of terrorism. Young students who had posters of Che Guevara were accused of terrorism. Correa sings to Che Guevara whenever he has a chance. So there is this use of the legal system to prosecute especially the left. Now, despite all of his strength, Correa is a giant with a feet of clay. He has not routinized his charisma into a political party where new leaders can be trained. His citizens' revolution is wholly centered on his persona. But as Chavez did at the age of 55 recently underlined, succession in such personalized regimes is always a very problematic issue. Unlike Morales, Correa doesn't have roots in civil society and social movements. On the contrary, as I said before, he's in war with social movements. He has actively sought to demobilize the indigenous population and to tame civil society, attacking NGOs. The Pachamama Foundation was closed in Ecuador. And he has not created participatory institutions at the local level. There's no equivalent to the communal councils or any other institutions of participation that Chavez created. So loyalties to Correa seems to be very feeble. On September 30, 2010, when the president went to the police barracks to try to calm down a police strike and almost got killed because he told the kids, if you are brave enough, you should kill the president. And then he was kidnapped in a hospital. Only a few bureaucrats took the streets to defend Correa. And in the elections, in the local elections of 2014, Correa's movement was defeated all across, in all major cities of Ecuador. Now, the response of the government was to start a discussion about the need to re-elect Correa again. And we don't know if Correa will run again in 2017, or the other option is that Correa does not run in one term and somebody else runs for him, and he sort of like Putin, controls everything, perhaps by phone from his apartment in Belgium, I don't know. But in any case, in Ecuador, the opposition is divided. And it's not only because the political system collapsed, but it's also because Correa has not threatened or is not perceived to have threatened the interests of the bourgeoisie or the middle class. On the contrary, under his regime, the biggest fortunes are doing very, very well. Former people who used to live in NGOs, very unstable lives, are working for the state with good salaries and stable positions. So the idea is that Correa is not threatening the interests of the middle class or of the elite, so there is no incentive to unite. The only victims of Correa who have united in an electoral front is the radical left of Pachacutic and the Maoist movement for democratic popular movement. So if Correa wants to run again, I am terrible predicting things, quite likely he will win, or perhaps he will win, any of his candidates might win, unless we have an economic collapse because of the prices of oil. Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it is. I've been sleeping since I arrived. But I will try to go fast. It isn't easy for me because this political situation in Venezuela has been very tough. And it's not so easy to take a little bit of distance to it and try to explain why it is so deep. But I think Carlos and Cindy have helped me with information, with data, and also because the idea of the populist leader helps me begin to say what happens when the populist leader dies. And what we are seeing in Venezuela is the passage of post-Chavism. Is it likely to have post-Chavism without Chavez? And that's the struggle of President Maduro. And from there, we're going to start with the crisis. What I will try to explain here is how a political crisis has been evolving from the very beginning of the election of Nicolás Maduro. And we will go through that, and we will go through what kind of regime they are trying to build with the disappearance of Hugo Chavez, which is not likely. I think this is diverse in these countries that have populism. In the case of Venezuela, it is not a modern regime what they're trying to build. They are very much trying to build a traditional patrimonial regime, and as the successors of Hugo Chavez. And they have problems with this because they have a portion of society that resists this kind of regime. So to compensate that, they will have to move. They have been moving into a very stark militarization of society and the relations between state and society. And then the political, I will argue that we've been in a political crisis ever since Nicolás Maduro won, but with its ups and its downs. And he had a brief relief in December with the elections, the local elections, the local elections of December the 8th. But the 4th of February, a protest began in the frontier city with Colombia of San Cristobal, and it was, the government responded with harsh repression, and it opened a cycle of protests that until this moment is still going on, and we don't know how it's going to finish. So, and I will come with some final comments. Well, the starting point of the crisis for me is the night of the 14th of April, when after one of the most unfair competitions, electoral competitions of Venezuela's history, Maduro rises to win with 1.5 of difference against candidate Enrique Capriles Radonski. That night he comes out as if he had won with 10 or 11 points like Nicolás Maduro. And the arrogance, the polarized speech from there on is the beginning for me of that crisis. The opposition, after such an unfair election, I mean, the government used, Chavez used to use it too, but Chavez was Chavez. And in any case, this is increasingly more and more unfair. The money, the employees, the transportation, the buildings, everything, in order to win. And then you would come up with 1.5 of difference. And you talk as if you had won a very fair election comfortably. So what happens? The opposition says, I want a revision of this election. I want an exhaustive revision. And the National Electoral Council, in control of Chavismo, says, no, we'll do the transmission evaluation, 100% audition on that. And of course, that's the most secure part of the election, is that part of the process. But they leave aside, I think it was clumsiness. They leave aside what would have probably given him a little bit more strength if they would have revised the whole thing. So what happens? Enrique Capriles Radonski says, I do not recognize your victory. And here we have the beginning, I think, of the political crisis. What has been the strategy of the government since before Chavez died, but throughout this year? In a routinization of charisma, they have been trying to show, first, that Maduro is the genuine heir of Chavez. Chavez pointed out his finger and he says, if something happens to me, he is my successor. And that is the brick where the regime is supposed to build its legitimacy, on the idea that they are the genuine heirs of Hugo Chavez, and so they are entitled to govern the country because they are the ones that can interpret what Chavez wanted to do with the country. Setting aside what socialism is, that really none of them really knows what it is. But I mean, they know that they are the genuine heirs of Chavez. And that means also that the cabinet, the key posts are loyal, the most loyal followers of Chavez. What we are seeing ruling Venezuela are, or the family of Chavez. The vice president is the son-in-law of Chavez. His daughter is the president of the Misión Milagro. He has brothers that are in charge of the electricity of states like Barinas. The children of Nicolás and of Celia Flores, well, one of them is a judge. He's 27 years old. The other one is in charge of the inspection of all the infrastructure that the government builds. He's 23 years old. We don't know what profession he has. Celia Flores has around 20 people that are in different posts of a family. We are seeing nepotism. For the followers are not only the genuine hires, the ones that had the devotion towards Chavez and followed him, but also the family as a kind of regime that is emerging. And that's why it's so difficult to have a law of anti-corruption, because you have to put nepotism in a democratic law of anti-corruption. And you can't do that because most of the family are in charge of posts. Devotion and loyalty are prior, it's not like Rafael Correa, of professionalism. I mean, what is important here is that Chavez knew you, liked you, you were devoted to. And so the inefficiency of the state is not a priority. And this, I think, is important to say, because I'm kind of perplexed of how the Venezuelan people, or the majority of the Venezuelan people, keep on voting for such an inefficient and corrupt government. And it has to do with the kind of legitimacy that is behind the Chavez phenomena. It's not a question of professionalism and efficiency. It's a question of loyalty, of devotion, of this exceptional person that lived and that gave us a legacy. There has been great investment before he died, during his sickness, and afterwards for the holiness of Chavez. He is now the Comandante Eterno, as part of a civilian religion that helps a cohesion among the followers. And of course, his legacy is El Plan de la Patria, converted into a law this January. The opposition is the devil, is Satanized. It is in alliance with the fascist, international fascism, CIA, and all the evil of the world. And this, even if it seems unbelievable for the 21st century, it is a common sense in a way, because in Venezuela, the communication, the media has been, during these years, very much controlled by what is called the public system media. And today, the common sense in Venezuela is built through 5 channels of public television, tens of radio stations, newspapers. The latest developments in this have been the buying of Globovisión and of Cadena Capriles. The private media has been now sold into the hands of entrepreneurs, of private entrepreneurs that are Chavistas. So really, for example, Enrique Capriles Radonski does not appear on TV anymore. It is prohibited. So in some moment they said, well, he can come if you edit it, but never alive, so he doesn't appear on TV. Even though they have invested tons of money of the petrostate to do this, they are having problems of governability. Ever since the beginning, they can't get in hold. Some people think, yes, Chavez may be a semi-god, but I think most of the people don't buy the bargain. I mean, they really don't buy it. And with this severe crisis, like Cindy has mentioned, with the data that she brought, what has come in to fulfill, to compensate the vacuum, it has been a stark militarization. I'm just going to go very quickly through them. Since the beginning, Chavez, when he was sick, he named an advisory council that he called el Comando Politico de la Revolución. Now, Maduro immediately called it el Comando Politico Militar de la Revolución. Since the very beginning, he had to show that the military was supporting him. And since then, of course, the military are advancing in their post. Very quickly, the government is exercised under military logic. We're always in emergency. We're always in war. We're in war, in an economic war, in a political war. Everything is a war. We always have operatives, operations to any task, to vaccinate people or to give them an identity card. Everything is an operation because everything is an emergency, because the government functions. It cannot function on a daily basis, a routine basis of civil life. It functions as a barracks, always an emergency and looking for a war. And against the war. The key public offices are enhanced in the military. Here I mentioned they have created the Organo Superior de Economia, a superior organ to coordinate the economy. A military is there. They have created una comisión estratégica for the security and the protection of the nation that controls, say, the information that comes and that can be diffused to the population. It is the military. The Minister of Interior is a military. The President of the National Assembly is an active military. The Governor of Zulia is a military. The Governor of Táchira is a military. The Governor of Guárico is a military. And it is more and more the posts are being controlled by the military. Some of them against the Constitution, because the Constitution says that an active military cannot be in charge of an electoral post like governor, and yet or the President of the National Assembly, and yet he has been brought back into activity this year by President Maduro. But this happens. The other things is, of course, very fast. Also holds civilian security, is in charge of the National Guard and the military are in charge of the civilian security of the country. A Plan Patria Segura is in hands of the military. They have had 3 increases of salary. They enjoy a high budget. They just gave them a new a TV channel. They created a new bank. The purchases of all kinds of toys for them. How is this possible? Well, the power, this has always been already commented by Carlos, the independence of power has been minimized. You can do unfair elections because you control the National Electoral Council. 4 of the 5 rectores are from the party. Some of them renounced their party affiliation a week before they were named, against according to the Constitution and the laws. It is supposed to be independent. The enabling laws that has been given to Nicolás Maduro was also possible because the executive controls the National Assembly. So who does the main laws in Venezuela is the executive, is the president. And the repression and political persecution has been possible too because of the control of the executive over judicial power, the general attorney, and the ombudsman. All these things happened during Chavez's administration and have been going deeper under Maduro. This development, according to the surveys, had Nicolas Maduro falling in popularity during last year. And in spite of that, the elections, the local elections, was a moment, an important moment for Maduro to know if he had been able, with all these strategies, to gain more legitimacy and capacity to control the governability. So a month before the election, and seeing that his popularity was dropping, the government came up with a very special strategy, a very unique strategy, and it was that he dramatically on the TV accused the entrepreneurs of doing, putting the prices of the electric appliances above the prices of the dollar with which they had bought it, and that they was speculating as part of the international conspiracy against Venezuela, the economic war that the enemies of Venezuela were trying to unstable him, and call the people to go to the stores and to take the appliances and to oblige the stores to put down the prices. This, believe it or not, was a very successful strategy. People saw where the enemy of Venezuela was. It was in the entrepreneurs that were doing business with the dollars that the government gave them at a very low rate, and that they were selling the things that they had bought at a with the illegal rate. Some of them were doing it, of course, but as always, the losers, the real losers, are the ones that really were doing what they had to do. And so this was called el dacazo. The dacazo was kind of an administered by the government looting of the stores, of the electrical appliances stores in Venezuela. And people went to the streets. Some of them were looted, but some of them, people made the lines. They went in. They were obliged to put down the prices, and people went out with the TVs and the refrigerators and all that. So at the end of the day, the election, the local election of December the 8th, wasn't bad for Maduro. They were anyway going to win the majority of the municipalities, but they also won the majority of the votes. And people went out, mobilized, and went out to vote. So they considered that they had won, even though the opposition had a good performance, won the main cities, increased their number of municipalities, but they had traced a plebiscite strategy in which they were fighting against Maduro. So Maduro won the majority of the municipalities, won the majority of the votes, and so he was perceived as the winner, and the opposition was perceived as the loser. So that brought a lot of tensions inside what is called la Mesa de Unidad Democrática, the opposition, right? Because the strategy had been unsuccessful. And so there has been, since December, a lot of tensions inside the opposition on what to do now. What do we do now? So unexpectedly, in the middle of this economic crisis, in the middle of the social crisis that Cindy has talked about, the data, homicides, social violence, social decomposition, all this. In the middle of this, the city in the frontier, Colombia, that has suffered the most, one of the states that has most suffered all the troubles of Venezuela, is the state of Táchira. They have a chip in their cars. They can't buy gasoline when they want to. They put up their prices. They have the paramilitaries of Colombia. They have the guerrillas of Colombia. They have the kidnappings in Venezuela. They have it all. So there's a protest, a student protest, because a girl was going to be violated in the campus of the university. The government responded with harsh repression, throw the boys into jail. That was like the drop that culminated the glass. And so protest starts there and has not stopped since. The government, the strategy of the government is to criminalize that protest and to repress the students and the civil society that now accompanies them, because it starts by the student movement, but immediately there's so many troubles, everybody goes to the streets in the main cities of the country, in all the cities in the country, in the highways, whatever. So what is the response of the government? Repression, criminalization, and it has brought us here. The protest gets violent. Violent actors come into the protests in some cities, and as Cindy has said, we have now above 40 deaths, hundreds of injured, detainees, etc. Until 2 weeks ago, Maduro, we have 2 full months in this. This country is practically paralyzed. Most of the offices work half a day. In the cities like Caracas, in the east of the city, sometimes they don't even open. Every day there's a protest of some kind. It's in one or another part of the city, not where the shanty towns are, because, among other things, the paramilitary groups control territories there, and so it's very difficult for people that are a minority to protest there, so they go to the east and they protest with the student movement and with the civil society of the east of Caracas and of the wealthy districts in other cities. But there is a great discontent. I mean, you may think that that it is the middle class that is out there, but it's really everybody is out there. Everybody that can is out there. And if they're not, they're in their house, but they're very discontent too. The response of the government has said that this is not a big problem, that they're controlling the situation, that this is an economic war, that this is a conspiration of the United States or the CIA or the fascism. And the minister of the military, he's a military general, said that this was a complot done in 2010, planified from Mexico. They trained the students. I mean, who can believe such a thing? But it does make a certain common sense when you repeat it 100 times on the TV and on the public system. So at the end of the day, for the first time, this kept on building and building, and 2 weeks ago, finally, the chancellor goes out in the world. He has to talk to his allies and so on, and UNASUR comes to Venezuela. The chancellors of UNASUR, Maduro accepts, and accepting that for the first time, the government accepts that he has a political conflict in the country. So this, I think, is very important what is going on right now. It's the first time that the government accepts not only that he has a political conflict, but that he needs somebody from outside to come and to help him. And that is a breaking point. So, I don't know if I left something out of here. So they arrived in Caracas last week, and they arrived in Caracas 2 days ago, and last night, finally, that little window, the opening a dialogue that has not been possible in the last 14 years, seems to be, 15 years, seems to be there. It may come out to nothing, but it is the window Venezuela has. And I'm going to just read my final comments. You excuse my English, it may not be good written. I didn't have anybody to revise it when I was doing it, but I'll try to, I hope you can understand it. Repression has been the main resource of Maduro in handling the political unrest, but it has had scarce success. The crisis has worsened with also deep economic and social problems. The presages are bad. Are we heading to a civil war? It seemed like that 2 weeks ago. And the little window that it was opened, UNASUR opened it a couple of weeks ago. And against what the skepticism of the opposition, they came to Caracas and they spoke to human rights ONGs and to the political parties. And they spoke and they heard, and they seemed to be that they understood the problem, or at least the opposition leaders and the ONGs of human rights were happy of the meetings that they had with UNASUR chancellors. First they were 4, last night there were 7 or 8 in Caracas chancellors of Latin America. The international image, one of the results is that the international image of Chavismo and Maduro has dropped slowly, but it's breaking. However, there are however, what I think stops the possibility of a balance here is that there is a lot of distrust of the opposition. because it is a very diverse opposition, because it has performed bad in the past, because they can't get along sometimes, and they seem, and for the presidents in Latin America, the most important point right now is, can they govern? Can they control this better than Maduro? I think they are not, they really still do not believe that the opposition could be a better solution than Maduro. And I think this is one of the points that it's trying to develop at this moment, to try to show, ensure that they have proposals and they have capacity to govern Venezuela. UNASUR may help then to overcome this crisis through peaceful and institutional channels. The other very important point was that they suggested that the Pope come in for mediation, and the government and the opposition accepted that this third person can come in from outside to mediate. And it seems that both of them trust the Pope and the Vatican, which is sin precedent in Venezuela. It's the first time that they recognize and that they find a person that can mediate. So in order to overcome this in a peaceful way, which is not clear that it will happen, it is really the route now, what opened last night, what we saw on the TV for 4 or 5 hours, was the beginning of a sit-down face-to-face to make possible a real political dialogue, not the dialogue that I have the truth and you have to see that I have the truth, and you come to me and we work together with the insecurity and this and the other thing, and the economy and so on with the entrepreneurs. No, you both have to recognize that there is truth in both, and if there's not, there has to be a space where we could peacefully try to manage these differences. This has not happened. Last night it did not happen either. But it is the beginning, because they sat down. They sat down and they spoke, and they looked at each other, and this was something that, and the whole, I think all Venezuela was looking at that to see, and I think it could be a beginning. I don't want to be too optimistic about it, but it could be the beginning of a way out in a peaceful way that would take us into the elections of next year, the parliamentary elections, but it would take us before that into the recomposition of the public powers that are right now absolutely controlled by Chavismo. Thank you.
Margarita, thank you. Thank you. I know this is a very difficult time, not only for your country, but for you and your family personally. Hector.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you for the book. I mean, for having been part of the book, and thank you for the invitation to be here today and to be with you, friends. Being here is always like, like a college reunion. Everybody has been a class off some year at the Wilson Center, and that's the thing. I was with Andy Seeley on the elevator and said, "Hey, what class are you?" or something like that. And it's always great, and it's always great to be here and great to discuss this extremely important topic, particularly because of the situation in Venezuela. I have this feeling that we're all Venezuelans now, and I have to make a big effort and discipline myself to the task of the day and talk about Argentina and not Venezuela, which is something I'm writing regularly these days. So in that light, let me say what I'm trying to do today. One of the goals of the book was to compare this populism. By the title, it suggests that, well, there is a populism of the 21st century. Where's the other one? What century? Well, that's the 20th century. And in the book, my contribution is to take an important case, which is Argentina, because it has had this populism in both centuries. And let me today share a little bit of that story that try to summarize what I say there to understand the origins and evolution of Peronism, the name of populism in Argentina. Before and after the democratization process of the 1980s, because I also think that's important to understand what's going on with, if you want, Kirchnerism, which doesn't qualify as such in my view, or Christianism, if you prefer, regarding what's going on in Argentina today. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on what's going on in Argentina today, its politics and the economy. And then conclude, since I can't help it, I'm going to conclude with some addressing some of the things that have been already said about Venezuela and comparing Venezuela and Argentina, because it is a little comparison that it's.
Bring your microphone
Oh.
closer.
How about now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, and then draw a couple of comparisons about, Argentina is becoming Venezuela and things like that, and no, Argentina is not becoming Venezuela. And it could never have become Venezuela, and I'm going to try to explain why. Well, first, my chapter in the book is a historical rendition of populism. I see populism in its emergence in Argentina as a delayed legacy of the Depression, the set of policies that accelerated economic change, a set of policies that accelerated industrialization, ISI, import substituting industrialization, the trademark of populism in Argentina and in several other countries of the region. And I address the fundamental sociological, economic, demographic, and cultural dimensions of populism. Urbanization, the creation of a multi-class coalition, the nationalist ethos, acquiring legitimacy that the country had never seen before. And I see populism as a crucial moment of incorporation of actors and groups into the political arena and into the marketplace. It's a historical phase of expansion of rights. Populism expanded, if we see democratic citizenship as the overlap of civil, political, and social rights. Populism is that moment of expansion of political and social rights fundamentally, with not so much concern for civil rights, and I'm going to address some of that later on. But in that sense, populism is a construction of citizenship. And I parallel some of the things that Carlos highlighted about the ultimate meaning of populism in the creation of a sense of dignity, which is the creation of citizenship. People with rights, people who have rights that before that moment didn't have them. And in that sense, it's a democratizing force, even if at times that happens despite itself. Even if at times it happens in spite of the leader, the populist leader, him or herself. Whether he or she is democratic or is not, nonetheless, as a historical phenomenon, I see populism as a democratizing phenomenon, as a democratizing historical phase. Now, from its origins, from its original version, the incorporation process of populism exacerbated distributional coalitions, and Argentina has been known for that since mid-20th century. Import substituting industrialization exacerbated the stop-and-go, boom and bust development trajectory in Argentina, which is common to several Latin American countries, one should highlight. And typically the confluence of the moment in which macroeconomic disequilibria met with balance of payment constraints, that was the moment, domestic macroeconomic crisis with the problems in the external sector of the economy, that created the deep political crisis that Argentina has been known for, and the typical cycles of authoritarian governments and more or less democratic governments. Peronism, populism, became, as of that moment, the impossible game. Guillermo O'Donnell's, tremendously effective label. The impossible game of Argentine politics, which made Argentina a divided society, a deeply divided society for an entire generation. And this is, I think, relevant for some of the things people are saying, about Venezuela, divided society, right? And that included the 3 years that people now tend to overlook the fact that Perón came back in '73 and became president. This is, if anything, if this is a populism or more or less Peronism, is the third time. First in the 40s and 50s, then in the 70s, a brief 3-year period of the Peronists in power, including Juan Perón, who died president in the midst of economic mismanagement and violence. The society was already a deeply divided society. And now the military regime of 1976-83, and things would change. Would change because of, I say in the chapter a couple of important issues in the international economy: the oil crisis, the indebtedness, the fantastic multiplication of a foreign debt, economic integration, globalization, and things like that. But domestically, a military regime determined to crush any form of dissent, which included the left, which included the Marxist left, violent or otherwise, but which also included Peronism. There was a very peculiar intellectual reasoning on the part of the military regime, which was that in the end, protectionism, ISI, had artificially enlarged the power of the working class. And with the working class, it had enlarged the political power of the unions. And in the process, the unions had become radicalized. And that was the source of instability and the ungovernability of society and violence. And in the radicalization of the working class and the unions was the source of this attempt to construct a communist regime that some organizations had during the 70s. And then they made an intellectual leap that would be momentous, would have momentous importance. Protectionism and the dismantling of protectionism was a tool to curb the radicalization of society. And not just the curb of implement more efficient trade policies, but a political tool. Adolfo Ganitrot wrote a magisterial piece early on, the political logic of the economic policies. That would change things for good. It would really weaken populism, it would weaken Peronism, and it would weaken its social base. And in the process, this military regime became a massive violator of human rights. Argentina became known for the desaparecidos, and Argentina made headlines those years for a dismal human rights situation. During the 80s, the country learned a couple of lessons as well. First of all, the human rights lesson. The lesson was to the importance of strengthening the civil component of citizenship. It was good with the expansion of social rights, with redistribution and egalitarianism. It was good with the expansion of suffrage. But we didn't take care much of civil rights. And if we had taken care of civil rights, we would have a much stronger constitutional state. And we wouldn't have had to suffer from being kidnapped from our homes at 3 a.m. without intervention of any judge. And being thrown out of a plane into the Rio de la Plata, as it happened. And this opened the way to democratization, and this opened the way to Peronism becoming a party and not just a movement. As opposed to Chavez, Peron didn't leave an heir. Some people would say, well, he was too narcissistic for that. Perhaps, but perhaps that was a good thing. And that's one of the things why Argentina is not Venezuela, and it'll come back later, hopefully, more fully. And the human rights agenda drove democratization in the 80s, and was and gave identity to the early phases of democratization for at least 10 years, and that was fundamental to at least leave the idea in that society, what you guys call consolidation of democracy, but at least to instill that idea that, well, this democracy is not the best we can have, but it's better than we ever had it before. This also until the crisis of 2001, 2003. Another thing, Peronism became a party to the extent that it lost an election. Populism doesn't lose elections. Peronism lost two. Lost 83, the first democratic election that Alfonsín won, and lost 99. And that also is a fundamental difference. It's a fundamental difference with itself, if you want. Peronism had become a party, PJ, Justice Party. Wasn't anymore a movement. Menem came to office in 89 in the midst of hyperinflation. Interestingly enough, this was still a consequence of the debt crisis and the lost decade of the 80s. Democracy came to town during the debt crisis. Menem implemented a currency board, price and exchange rate stability, openness to trade and capital accounts. Some of our friends began to call that neoliberal populism for short, term. Yet again, there was something about Menem's policy that was consistent with the history of Argentina and many countries in the region, which was its inability to implement counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy. The country went with a boom. There was, with the stability, there was foreign investment. There was privatization that in turn triggered more of that foreign investment. That generated the typical boom and bust cycles of oil or of soy or of low interest rates. You get real exchange rate appreciation, you build a current account deficit over time, you incur more debt to finance the current account deficit. That affects your fiscal sector. You tend to run a fiscal deficit. And then again, the boom-bust cycle, whether under a closed economy or under open economy, happened again, and it collapsed the whole arrangement in 2001-02, without a president in office, with a radical president, de la Rúa. By that time, Argentina made headlines again because of the default, the devaluation, and the worst economic crisis in the country's history. But it was worse than that, because there was the deepest political crisis of democracy. People came to the streets demanding that the Minister of Finance should leave, then demanding that the whole cabinet should leave, then demanding that the president should leave, and they all left. But then they also wanted everybody to leave. Que se vayan todos. The democratic contract, the democratic social contract, was severely damaged, if not broken altogether. Oh, I'm good, 4 or 5 minutes, don't worry. And that created a political crisis that the country has not fully overcome ever since. A crisis, a political crisis that keeps coming back to haunt the political system, and that it constitutes the most severe source of political instability of Argentine democracy. Peronism got fragmented in the 90s. Proof of that is that in the 2003 election, 3 Peronist candidates competed with one another. Néstor Kirchner, who won, Adolfo Rodríguez Sá, and Carlos Menem, who wanted to come back and didn't make it. Very much in the tradition of Peronist politics, I always remember being in Argentina in the months prior to the election, and I went to Congress to visit some people, and I ran into one and said, "Hey, how are you? How are you doing?" Hey, good to see you. Hey, who are you with? I asked this member of Congress, and he says, "I have no clue. It's very even." Apropos programmatic and ideological concerns when it comes to your political preferences, right? Kirchner won, who was handpicked by the transition president Eduardo Dualde, a Peronist and former senator. Kirchner won with 23% of the vote, and what appeared as a problem had a positive externality. Weakness forced Kirchner to make deals. And in a country with such a presidential and strong executive authority tradition, that was a good thing. The best deal that Kirchner did was with the opposition in Congress to reform the Supreme Court and make it professional, independent, and democratic. And that certainly happened. And Argentina was in deep crisis, but things began to change, particularly for the things that always change Latin American economies: international prices. Prices began to increase. Argentina began to enjoy terms of trade that it had not enjoyed in at least 2 generations. And by 2005, Kirchner managed to restructure the outstanding debt and win a midterm election comfortably. And that drove and sparked dreams of perpetuation. The design was a 16-year total, alternation between husband and wife, that he had the bad idea of ruining halfway in the process. And that triggered the kinds of things that also Argentina became known for in the last few years. Attacks on the press, curbing the press, and curbing the independence of the judiciary, and the politics of the checkbook, as some people call it. Checks, fiscal resources for friends and allies, and for foes, fragmentation. And again, pro-cyclical economic policy. Once again, boom and bust, and Kirchner enjoying all the good prices of the recent 6, 7, 8 years. Typical, whether it's oil, as in Venezuela, whether it's debt, as in Latin America in the 70s during the period of low interest rates, or whether it's soy, as it is today. The two Kirchner government have gone with a boom, and yet again, some of those macroeconomic symptoms began to show. Growth, but with real exchange rate appreciation, government spending fueling the boom phase, and this equilibrium was weathered as prices remained strong. Since 2011, however, prices began to decline, gradually and not too steeply, but still decline. Government spending increased, and this widened the fiscal deficit, and therefore the exchange rate appreciation began to neutralize the favorable trade surpluses. Argentina is in a trade equilibrium now. I mean, the surplus has been completely undone. This has led, for the last 2+ years, to increasing pressures on the exchange rate that the government dealt with in a cumbersome system of foreign exchange control, similar to the Venezuelan, but not quite so exaggerated, which affected investment, which fueled inflation, which was resolved with misrepresentation of, misreporting the inflation rate. What's Argentina's inflation rate, which affected, of course, credibility, and which was addressed with the increasing shortage of foreign exchange was increased with the confiscation of Repsol, the oil company, and on the political side, with an intense battle against Clarín in particular, but against private media, independent media in general, and a judicial reform law that attempted to reorganize the appointment of judges at all levels in the creation of a new council that the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. The independent Supreme Court that Nestor Kirchner was forced to appoint back in 2003. And then came the 2013 election, just last October, where Sergio Massa, a Peronist, like everybody else, won in the Buenos Aires province, the district without which you cannot carry the presidency, and won with a different type of rhetoric and a different type of program, trying to rebuild credibility. He aligned himself from day one with the independent press and the independent judiciary. And then the economy, quickly. Argentina is undergoing now an orthodox macroeconomic adjustment that the government doesn't call it so, but that's what it is. There's been a devaluation, there's been an increase in interest rates, there's been a slowdown of money supply. Some important subsidies in energy have been eliminated, subsidies that opposition politicians, economists, the international community has been saying this is costing, this energy subsidy that Nestor Kirchner implemented cost the country $20 billion a year. Now those subsidies are being eliminated. Subsidies largely to the middle class, it should be said. The propane tank always costs 3 times as much as the gas that the middle class apartment in downtown Buenos Aires gets on the line. But that had to do with Nestor Kirchner's idea and obsession with the middle class, with this rebellious middle class that is not fully supporting of him. And the middle class in Argentina is not fully supporting of anybody. So he should have known better. Government spending has been reduced. All of this in the hope of attracting fresh investment. All of this in the hope of making Vaca Muerta shale gas, project the wonder of Argentina. That's what Argentina is going to be saved by, and perhaps what Cristina Kirchner is going to be saved by. And we'll see. We'll see if this very recent macroeconomic discipline and orthodox stabilization will continue, or whether, as we approach the election season next October, 2015 October, whether government spending and inflation will resume. But right now, that's where we stand. With some good notes, with some highlights, I would say, that are the source of hope, for hope. And this addresses the last part, as I said, trying to address some of the important issues that Margarita has shared with us, as the Venezuelan crisis is fundamental, not just for Venezuela, it's fundamental for Latin America as a whole. This is the critical juncture of Latin America, Latin American democracy at stake. I'll try to say a couple of things, if I have a minute. Is Argentina becoming Venezuela? No. There is a standard article by now. There's a standard op-ed in U.S. newspapers. Argentina is becoming Venezuela. No, for two reasons. First of all, the source of wealth is in private hands in Argentina. It's not in state hands. Soy is privately owned. Is the agricultural exporters. Second, there is a Peronist party, a party of order and stability, a party that has made its goal, has reduced itself to a confederation. If you want, Argentina is a federal country, but the Peronist party is hyper-federalism, is a confederacy of territorial bosses that make deals for territorial control. Therefore, it's a conservative party. It's a party of order and stability. A party that, by the control of the territory, some key governorships and the industrial belt outside Buenos Aires, this is where Sergio Massa comes from, by the way, would never have allowed something of the things we have seen in Venezuela for a long time, and especially what we have seen recently, would never have allowed for the Cubans to come into the country and give orders to the military officers, would never have allowed for the paramilitary on motorcycles shooting at people. They control the territory, their own infrastructure. It's a little bit like a nastier American urban machine. Let's put it that way. Not too nastier, however. Don't get now, some traits. The control of the media that Chavismo accomplished in Venezuela is unthinkable in Argentina. Argentines came out against the attempt to control the media and to make the judiciary dependent on the executive. Finally, there are commonalities. First, boom and bust strategy of development. Oil in Venezuela, obviously, and soy or debts in the case of Argentina. Soy today, debts in the past. And there is a commonality in some important political elements, discursive perhaps, but important nonetheless. A common late distorted wannabe populism, if you want to put it that way. That is regressive, it's not progressive. If not reactionary. Reactionary because it reacts to progress. It has reacted to a comprehensive understanding of citizenship that has anchored its definition in egalitarianism, in the expansion of social rights, and in the expansion in universal suffrage, but also in the democratization process of the 80s, has anchored its definition of citizenship in a full-fledged constitutional state that is now in trouble, obviously, in Venezuela, but which the Cristina Kirchner government in particular has attempted to curb in Argentina and has failed. And has failed because of the reaction of society for the most part, including the Peronist party. Finally, think about this. I was thinking about, and this is the last comment, what a fusion of power you see in just Cabello in the case of Venezuela. Speak of, democracy and authoritarianism, or as the Episcopal Conference labeled in its report last week, the totalitarianism. So if an Argentine is mediating, another Argentine is free to describe things about Venezuela. this is Cabello, who's a military,
Active.
executive.
He's active.
Here's your executive power, who is a legislator, legislative power, and who is in the judiciary. He went personally to pick up Leopoldo Lopez and take him to prison. So he's the three powers of the state in one. Talk about democracy, separation of powers, and confront that with, seriously, not even authoritarianism, with what totalitarianism is, which is the fusion of power. The Soviet state was exceedingly labeled by experts way back as the fusion of elites, the fusion of powers. Three functions in one, which authoritarianism in its original formulation, Juan Linz and others, doesn't have a fusion of the three branches of the state. May have two, but hardly ever three. And this is what's going on. It's perhaps symbolic, and it's not as deep as it would have been in a true totalitarian state, but it's important enough to pay attention to that. And that's why I think we are all Venezuelans today. What's going on in Venezuela and the capacity of the Venezuelans to resolve this conflict, avoid civil war, and rebuild democratic institutions will have effects on the rest of the region, especially on the rest of the progressive and left-wing democratic left in the rest of the region. Thank you.
Hector, thanks. I'm going to just make a couple of brief comments because I know everybody wants to get to questions to Margarita and about Venezuela. Just to sum up some of the authoritarian and democratizing aspects of populism. Most of the studies of radical populism in the Andean region, looking at Chavez, Morales, and Correa, look at questions of institutional design and say that these three governments are undermining or destroying liberal democracy in the name of fulfilling popular aspirations. The growing authoritarianism of these regimes is reflected in the way that power is held and exercised. Some leaders continue to win elections, even fair elections, and enjoy strong popular support. But the institutions and the legal frameworks that constrain the unfettered exercise of power by presidents have been systematically eroded. There have been constitutional reforms that do away with limits on presidential terms. There has been the weakening or elimination of checks and balances. As Hector was saying, the fusing of these various branches of government, also the doing away with mechanisms of horizontal accountability within governments, not just the vertical accountability that's exercised by citizens, as well as the packing of institutions such as the judiciary or electoral councils. And as we've heard from virtually all of these presentations, the pressures on independent media are explicit and state-directed, aimed at harassing and punishing critics and limiting the free flow of information. As we've heard, the polarization of society is fostered from the top down. Politics are lived not as a process of bargaining, but as full-blown confrontations between irreconcilable interests and whose defense rests on the utter vanquishing of the other. And it will be very interesting to see whether the current dialogue underway in Venezuela can overcome some of these dynamics. Now, as much as we look at the destruction or the erosion of liberal representative democracy, it's important to keep in mind the way that populist regimes have stayed in power, have built popular support, and democratized their nations in certain ways. What are these democratizing credentials? These lie first and foremost in the political, economic, as well as symbolic inclusion of the excluded. Under classical populism, as Hector pointed out, the expansion of the vote, of the franchise, intersected with a broader process of the distribution of socioeconomic benefits. In Venezuela, the poor have benefited dramatically. Levels of poverty and even inequality have declined in ways that offset, for many in the Chavista base, the damaging consequences of the distortions produced and reflected in shortages, inflation, and the weakening or destruction of the manufacturing sector. Populism in the Andes has also fostered ethnic inclusion. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in Bolivia's history. That is not an insignificant event. And if you look at democratization at the local level, you can see and understand the complexity of how democratization and authoritarianism, how top-down and bottom-up dynamics are mixed. An important aspect of understanding politics in Venezuela today is that Chavez created, Maduro has not dismantled, a number of institutions of participatory democracy at the local level. Margarita has pointed this out in all of her writings, the community water committees, the community councils that have driven a significant bottom-up dynamic for access to public services and goods. That helps to explain the support for the Venezuelan government among poor Venezuelans. If we speculate about the future of populist regimes, of course, we have to look at the boom and bust cycle in commodity prices. All of the Andean populists in Argentina in general have derived support and legitimacy from the tremendous increase in income from commodities and their ability to distribute them. But Chavismo, at the most extreme, is not just based on this material distribution of benefits in exchange for political loyalty. Without diminishing the importance of these benefits, it's also important to remember not only the charisma of Chavez and the emotional connections that he was able to forge with large segments of the electorate, charisma that he has not been able to transfer to Maduro. Populism, Chavismo, creates political identities, a sense of empowerment, and these kinds of things have outlasted his rule, even as Margarita has pointed out, Maduro is a very weak heir to Hugo Chavez. But it's important to look to not just the objective dimensions, the concrete economic benefits, but also the subjective aspects, the way people feel empowered, recognized, and dignified by populist governments. We can speculate, I think, in the discussion period about where Venezuela is going to go, whether the dialogue will be successful, whether the future of Venezuela is civil war, to what extent Venezuela does or does not represent a test case, for all of the region. But I think what we need to address in looking at the future of Latin American democracy is how to reconcile the substantive goals of inclusion and equality with the goals that are traditionally thought of as part of democratization studies of procedures and institutions. These unmediated processes of popular identification with the leader that characterized populism will take priority over the mediated politics of representative government unless political systems find ways to respond to citizens' demands. So the challenges of democratic deepening cannot just focus on improving political procedures and institutions. To make political participation meaningful, to improve the capacity of the state to respond effectively and with transparency to citizens' demands and to reinforce the rule of law. Issues of inclusion, of socioeconomic inclusion, of ethnic and symbolic inclusion cannot be treated as secondary. Things that should be taken up in the sphere of public policy with their redress or their satisfaction subject to the effectiveness and capacity of governance institutions. I think our book serves as a reminder that the voice of the people, if you want to put it in those terms, is heard often and insistently with respect to the non-political demands for inclusion, and how that voice finds expression, whether who listens and whether it is expressed through channels, I think determines the potential to reinforce liberal representative democracy or to destroy it via populism. So on that note, with that inquietud, duda, I'd like to open it to questions. Please wait for the microphone. Identify yourselves, if you will. I'd like to thank my associates in the Latin American program, Eric Olson here in the back, Veronica Colon Rosario, Christine Zeno, Catherine Moffat, our research assistant. Thank them all for their help with putting together this event. I see Evan, John, and then one over here. So we'll start with a first round and come back here. Evan, sure.
Thank you. Evan Ellis, Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. First of all, congratulations to the panel and to the Wilson Center for presentations which were thoughtful, comparative, and contextual, even focusing on, I think, something very valuable, the construction of populist identity, which one doesn't hear much these days in Washington. My question has to do with one key difference between populism of the 20th versus 21st century. And of course, one could make the argument that in the 20th century, in one way or another, the populisms were reined in by some of the inherent economic contradictions and resource limitations, cycles boom and bust. In the 21st century, the era of globalization, one could make the argument that we have a slightly different dynamic with, for example, and Cynthia knows where I'm going with this, the availability of new actors such as China through the provisioning of loans beyond the Western system, as we've seen in Ecuador and Venezuela elsewhere, expanded demand for commodities, which sustains commodity cycles, that in many ways perhaps extends the life cycle of populism beyond which, and perhaps to a higher precipice beyond where it would have originally collapsed in the 20th century. Could I ask you to perhaps speculate on how such extra-regional actors such as China may change the dynamics of 21st century populism versus what might have happened with 20th century populism?
Okay, let's take John over here. Christine?
Thanks very much, Cynthia. Let me also echo Evan's congratulations and thanks to the panel for some great presentations this morning. Carlos, you very eloquently explained that populists tend to need enemies. They tend to need to be able to define and then demonize the other, the outsider. And in history, we've seen this, whether it was Jews in the Third Reich or other folks. Foreigners tend to make good targets for populists. Hector, right at the end, mentioned something that leads me to my question. A very important group of foreigners in Venezuela today are the Cubans. And so my question is for Margarita or for anybody is, if you could speak a little bit about how average Venezuelans perceive the role of Cuba and especially things that kind of tend to violate the very essence of the sovereignty obsession that populists tend to have, things like Cubans in National Guard uniforms, things like Cubans caught on YouTubes that are giving instructions to colectivos. How is that getting out to average Venezuelans, and how are they reacting?
Okay, and there was one more on this side of the table. Someone over here. Sure, I'm sorry. We'll take a second round.
Hi, my name is Jose de Bastos. I'm a journalist from Venezuela. My question to Professor Lopez Maya, how do you think it hurts the opposition to be divided in this dialogue, in its objective to get something from the government? And do you think that the government can use this division as a way as an extortion to the opposition and say to the moderates, we can give you this, but you have to condemn the extremists in the opposition? Thank you.
Okay, let's stop with that first round. I'm going to go to Margarita, I think, first. Go ahead.
Well, let me see. About the Cubans, I'll take that one first. It kind of perplexes me that with all the nationalism of the Venezuelans, it hasn't been, with the Cubans, such a tension that one would have supposed. And I think it has to do with the polarization. The polarization in the society is very extreme. It's a combination of the polarization in the first place. I mean, for Chavez, it was very important, the element of the Cubans as that support, advice, protection, and many other things, and he continuously praised them. But it also has to do with the control of the media. I think it becomes a combination that makes that the portion of the people that keep on supporting Chavismo without Chavez keep on, do not have to, it may be uncomfortable, but it's not a priority for them if that is there. It could come worse afterwards, but it is not the problem at the moment. So I think that would be my answer with respect to that. With, of course, for the opposition, it's the sovereignty, and it's one of the main issues, but it's not on the table. It's not on the table. On the table are the human rights, on the table are the liberation of the students, and above everything, we have to change the public powers because they are completely controlled by Chavismo. If we cannot have a peaceful way out, if we don't change the National Electoral Council, the judicial, as you have explained, with the judicial, it attends the telephone of the vice president and gives the sentence. Last night it came out again, and it came out very, very starkly. I mean, the government does not lose a case in the judicial power. So I think, so that reveals that it is not a priority, not even for the opposition, because it's so grave, so severe, the other problems. And, but it's there, and it has to produce in the military tensions. But the military have acted until now in a very cohesive way supporting Chavez. They're behind supporting Maduro. They're behind Maduro. They haven't shown tensions. There are some things, but I think it's not, that show that there are some signals, some symptoms of discontent. But they are ruling, so why should they be discontent in a way? They have the power. They have the businesses. They are, and all that has to do with the dollar business, the food business. So I think there is discontent for some things, like the Cubans in there, and they have asked for that. And there was some speculation about that last year. But right now that they see that the Maduro is in danger, there is a lot of cohesion of Chavismo in general and of the military in particular around Maduro. And that's what he has, the military and the upper public officers. That's his, and he controls the power. But the people in the streets, and that's why I have doubts of Chavismo without Chavez is really going to live long. I have my doubts because I see it weakening and weakening. I mean, you have the control of the power when you have the military there, but you don't have the, less and less you have the people, because you have a very severe economic crisis. You have a very severe social crisis with this violence and these paramilitaries and these territories that are free from controlling you. And you're not doing good with your money, with your petrodollars. You're not giving it enough. You're not giving enough to the community councils. You're not giving, and you can do these shows with the electric appliances and maybe tomorrow with some food and so on, but that's not going to be enough, I think. So, and I don't, and one of the things that happens here with populism is that what he left behind is too mediocre. I mean, there's nobody there that seems to be thinking, that seems to have the intelligence to take a decision. I mean, Maduro is there trying to do what Chavez would have done. I mean, but he's very rigid in that because Chavez was an intelligent political guy. He received orders all his life. So he tries to imitate him in his voice and his gestures and what have. He would have polarized, he would have insulted, he would have talked about his children, he would have made jokes, and he does that. But it's, I mean, yeah, it doesn't convince, I think. And it's a matter of time. But the other two, I don't know if I should go into them. I just wanted to say that I agree with Victor. The big problem in Venezuela that we don't have institutions to get out of this problem. That everything is confiscated by Chavism. So it is really the attempt right now in the dialogue table is to try to rescue some kind of public power, the judicial, the National Electoral Council, that could help us start building a way out. because it is the weaknesses of Chavismo, but it's also the danger of the civil war, because it's violence, it's sheer force what we have, and that's what we're trying to prevent. But there is it's very unequal, the forces in a civil war here, because the armed part is with the government. The civilian part that is resisting doesn't have the arms of the government, doesn't have the support of the government. The world is not going to give them the support. So, I mean, it's a very uneven situation for them. And I think, though, that what we have to try to concentrate is on the idea of rescuing the public powers to find a way out of the situation and without so much violence.
Carlos, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, sure. I would like to address very briefly Evan's question. I think that what is very interesting about the difference of the 20th and 21st century populism in terms of resources is that, and I'm talking about the three, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, these three countries can be described with Fernando Coronil's term of the magical state. They depend on the resources from the rent of oil. And what they have had is incredible unbounded agency, right? And for the short term, they have been able to not be submissive to the international organizations or the demands of the International Monetary Fund. Also, there's a lot of secrecy in the deals that they have done with China. We do not really know because there's a lack of it's very difficult to do investigative journalism. So we don't know yet, and the things that come out of it is very corrupt and very complicated. The Chinese were selling Ecuadorian oil, and then they were, they were buying it and then selling it to the international market. So we don't know what's going on. But at the end, we're still in the cycle of boom and bust. And I think that they have not escaped from that.
Hector, go ahead.
Yeah, briefly on this same issue. Well, this commodity cycle appears to extend itself quite a bit. It's at least a decade, if not more. However, in the case of Venezuela, I think it's coming to an end by its own mismanagement. And here, it's important to draw distinctions. Correa is an extraordinary manager compared to the others. No, I mean, his fiscal policy, well, his monetary policy is decided a couple of blocks from here, so, that is an advantage, right? The currency is the US dollar in Ecuador. So let's not forget that. That helps in terms of, his macroeconomic discipline. So, and China is one of the, powers that is driving this cycle, and we all know that. And we'll see. We'll see when it slows down. We'll see how it falls. We'll see who is where at the time of the slowdown when the cycle changes. One of the things about, quickly, about the opposition, I think our Venezuelan friends, in their criticisms of the opposition, sometimes lose track of what it must be to be opposition in Venezuela. I mean, it's like it's an unfair criticism, whether Capriles this or Leopoldo that, and the divisions. I think it's admirable what they managed to do. What they did yesterday night in this context can be a critical juncture, can perhaps change the game. It's admirable. It's impossible. It's like, to be opposition in that system, to be opposition to that government. I mean, one should cut them some slack quite a bit. And finally, one thing. About Cuba and the enemies, the empire, one of the things I say in class is that populism is always in opposition and is always weak, and it's part of reflected in the book, in the rhetoric, even if they can be in power forever, right? Look at these governments. They have changed the constitution, they packed the Supreme Court, they packed the Electoral Council, they've been in power for 15 years in the case of Venezuela, Correa, who knows how long. The Kirchners will be in power for 12 years. It's 11 now. And they're the weak party that some conspiracy is going to throw them away. And they're going to lose power. Well, if all those conspiracies, if any of those conspiracies had been really strong, they would have been out of power by now. So this is the purpose of this enemy argument. And it's effective.
Let me just add one or two things to Evans. I mean, the growth of the Chinese economy between 9 and 11% and the demand for commodities and for energy resources is the story of all of South America and commodity producers in Latin America, not just populist governments. So the question really is, you know, people are already in the World Bank and everywhere talking about, you know, a deceleration, lower levels of growth, rising expectations by this middle class that has benefited during the period of the commodity boom. Slight slowdown in China, although when you look at, you know, a slowdown from 9 to 7%, you're still growing, you know, pretty fast. You know, at some point, the question is what will happen to all of Latin America, all of South America, you know, should Chinese demand dramatically contract? So there is that kind of question hanging out there. There's no evidence right now that that's happening, but it's clearly been a factor and the major explanation for the spectacular growth and the reductions in poverty and growth of the middle class, you know, across the region. Not every government has squandered it as badly as Venezuela has. You know, not only in Ecuador, but in Bolivia, there's been an enormous accumulation of reserves. So just as Chile was able to use copper reserves in 2008 in a countercyclical way, you know, there's evidence that, you know, Venezuela may fare much more poorly, you know, than other countries, Argentina probably not close behind, in terms of its ability to implement, you know, countercyclical policies. In response to John's question about, you know, the Cubans, my question really is whether the encounter of ordinary Venezuelans with Cubans in the country is in, you know, with doctors in the misiones, you know, and all of these people that have been providing services in poor neighborhoods. I mean, I heard, I mean, it kind of shocked me to hear World Bank officials, you know, praising the misiones for the, you know, unprecedented delivery of benefits and social services, you know, in poor neighborhoods in ways that had never happened, you know, in Venezuela, let alone in most other countries. And so I think we have to, you know, keep that piece in mind. And there's a difference between not just the opposition and Chavistas, but people, you know, who live and who have benefited from these kinds of services as opposed to the ones that are being, you know, shot at because they're, you know, our Cuban advisors, you know, with the colectivos or whatever. So I think we have to keep that in perspective as well. Let's take another round. I see that hand in the back. I see here. Ulrich, how about if everybody could go really fast, we'll take everybody's question and do one last round, and we'll be done. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marcela Colmenares, and I come from the Center for Democracy and Development in the Americas. Yesterday at the debate, this question goes mostly for Margarita Lopez Maya, but like, feel free to answer if you want. Capriles said that there were two Venezuelas, the ones in the room and the ones outside in the street protesting. I think that was like very amusing for me to like hear because it was very different from what I was expecting. But at the same time, I think he was referring to the possibility of civil war. You here are referring to the possibility of civil war, yet you're saying that the protests right now are not even comparable like to the ones of the Caracazo in '89. And even in Caracazo, there wasn't really a civil war movement. I mean, afterwards there were problems and like whatever things, but are we bluffing when we say that there is actually a possibility for civil war in Venezuela right now? Or is this a real possibility, and where would it come from?
Great. Let's pass the mic down to this side. We'll take, Ulrich will just go around, and if people could really be brief, it would be great. I see everybody, thanks.
I'm Timothy Towell, a retired U.S. diplomat, 30 years in the State Department, but in the 20th century, not the 21st. So I'm an old-fashioned man, and 30 years from Kennedy to Clinton in military governments, our allies against godless communism. So I have a different mind view, perhaps. So I'd like to go to militarization and Cubans. Professor Lopez Maya said there's signs of discontent, hooray. But then you said, but the military has the power, the petrodollars. Let's talk about that power. Don't they have big offices in the capital, state capital in Caracas, Naugahyde furniture, big staff, including pretty girls, carros blinda, armored cars, fancy houses. But they don't have what I've always observed in my 30 years, where lieutenant colonels and majors have something different. It's called troops. It's called firepower. Yes, they have spies and people monitoring them and supervisors. Yes, they have nasty Cubans dressed up as Venezuelans. But aren't there patriots now who read Bolivar and the heroes and say, enough's enough, and then go out and do something? Coups are 20th century, we're all against it, including W. Bush, but hey, let's move on.
Great. Ulrich, please try to be really concise so we can get everybody in. That's all right.
Ulrico Reale, I'm a lawyer here in town. Cynthia, let's perhaps get back to the United States. And maybe the question is to you rather than to the panel who comes from overseas. We had a very interesting week here in Washington, D.C. We saw three hearings on the Hill which are related to Venezuela. There were two in the House and one on the Senate side. In the House, we saw Roberta Jacobson. She's the Attorney General for the Western Hemisphere. And she made some very interesting statements in reference to the government of Venezuela, to the offer from Venezuela to tender an ambassador out of the blue moon. Then we saw the Secretary Kerry on the side, on the Senate side with Menendez. And he went there to talk a little bit about the implication of the foreign assistance in the U.S. budget on 2015, and he had so many questions. He spoke very little about it, but he spoke a lot about Venezuela. So what's going on here? And what is the response of the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, to the many requests from Maduro to send an ambassador to start diplomatic relations, then the next day accuses the president of being a terrorist or something, all these paradoxes that we see in this town?
Okay. Let's go to the inside of the table here.
Thank you. Rafael Alejandro Jaro, Organization of American States. Two very quick questions. One in particular about Bolivia and the importance to that country for access to the sea. Recently, they have brought that case before The Hague, in particular to ask whether Chile has an obligation to negotiate a sovereign access to the Pacific Ocean for them, what might happen in case that petition does not go as they would hope. The other question I have is which countries are serving as a model for these populist regimes? We've heard that Panama wants to be Chile, Chile wants to be, well, used to want to be Hong Kong, now I think it wants to be Sweden. Nicaragua might want to be Venezuela, some people in Venezuela might want to be Cuba, other people like Capriles now wants to be Lula in Brazil. Is there a realized plan for these countries that they can see it in action and see how it works?
Back here, yes, in the corner.
My name is Liz Alarcon, and I'm from Georgetown University. My question was for Margarita, but for anyone else who has input too. When the MUD met with the government regarding violence a couple of months ago, there was dialogue and criticism around that, and there was not really any follow-up. Do you think that the dialogues from yesterday will be the same, that there will not be follow-up afterwards, or do you think there will actually be a plan from both sides to mitigate the conflict?
Okay, and last question, one and then two, and we're done.
I would like to raise a question regarding...
Your name, please, I'm sorry.
Sorry. It's Karen Bosikovic from the Organization of American States. And I would like to ask a question regarding corruption and the penetration of drug trafficking, and whether both corruption and corruption networks, not so much distribution collections, but distribution coalitions, not so much distribution coalitions, but corruption networks and the penetration of drug trafficking, whether these two elements could differentiate populism from the 20th century from populism of 21st century, and if so, how, whether these two elements changes the essence of populism, and how does it do that?
Okay, and last question down here.
My name is Marcio Coimbra from the Institute of World Politics here in Washington. I would like a quick word from the panel, anyone from you, about Brazil and the relationship that Brazil has with one of the countries and all of the countries, and Lula, and all the movements that all these countries and these parties, how they work together and how they influence one another.
Okay. Why don't we start at that side? Hector, this will be the last round, but let's take, we're over our time already.
I'll
so
be
we'll
brief because
yeah.
I leave all the Venezuela-specific questions for Margarita, who knows best. But I want to address the issue of corruption. There's never been so much money in politics in Latin America as there is now. It's part of the commodity boom. It's part of the magnitude of the boom. For some countries in Latin America, there's never been better terms of trade. Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, I don't know, Venezuela, Argentina, you have to go back to 1945, immediate post-war to see equivalent terms of trade. And yeah, this is a source of power. Add to that equation something that didn't exist in the populism of the 20th century, which is drug dealers and very porous borders that make all the equation a lot more complex. And then Brazil, well, Odebrecht. That's what's, wherever you go, public infrastructure in Latin America is Odebrecht. What would Dilma say? Well, she's taking care of, her own economy. And you go to CELAC, the Cuban regime is re-legitimized after it was, socialists in Latin America in the 90s used to say, well, enough with the single-party regime. We're all political democracies. Why not Cuba? Ricardo Lagos used to say that, by the way, socialist president of Chile. Well, that is over. Simultaneously with CELAC, Dilma was inaugurating the new side of the port in Havana, built by Odebrecht, and Odebrecht was right there. I mean, this is, new. This is really new, and it's dramatically changing because it's making it a lot more corrupt, plain and simple, than it was in the 20th century.
Carlos.
Well, addressing again the issue of corruption and drug trafficking, the politics of polarization, the invention of enemies, the destruction and the attacks to the independent media. So now it's much more difficult to do investigative type of journalism, which was one of the big advantages of the 80s and 90s in Latin America. You have the beginning of watchdog journalism. That's very difficult to do that. The control of the executive of all branches of power and the lack of organization of accountability make it very difficult to know how much corruption and drug trafficking is going on. For instance, in Ecuador, they were sending drugs. They were sending cocaine to Italy in the valija diplomática. I don't know how you say
Diplomatic
that.
pouch.
I mean, it was not just that somebody was sending a gram to his friend. I mean, they were sending tons of cocaine. And nothing has happened out of that. Just an anecdote.
Okay.
Venezuela, too. Venezuela's airport is controlled by the National Guard. In Paris, the plane landed with tons of drugs there that couldn't have been passed without the National Guard knowing it. I'm going to go very, very, very fast. No, I forgot. I apologize about how does the division of the opposition affect their performance right now. Well, believe it or not, I think it doesn't affect it too much on the table. Why? Because I have an anecdote there. Since last year, I was invited by the Catholic University to sit down in a table of analysis, with half of the academics there being advisors of Mesa de la Unidad. Every time they come, they say that the Mesa de la Unidad is finished. It implodes. They don't talk to each other. They can't work together. They can't agree on anything. And yet when they go out to talk, they work. And that division works. I mean, they did not agree with the street protest of Leopoldo Lopez and Maria Corina Machado. They severely disagree. The majority of the parties of the country disagreed with that. But it worked. And now they take now they're taking part of the advantage of what happened there. So I think that the movement of pluralism helps to give a little bit of flexibility in a very difficult ambience, like you say. I mean, how do you do opposition there? I mean, they ask me sometimes, and I don't know. I don't know what is best. If you have all your blocked, all your public powers, you have to take to the streets. But how do you take to the street? But you have to have some people that say that they don't like the street because the street is too violent, that can sit with you and talk politics as parties. And so I think it kind of works the other way around. It is difficult because outside they say, but how are these people going to govern? I mean, if they can't agree in anything, no? And that is a huge problem. But that is the complexity of the moment, and has helped the opposition move in a very complex, difficult situation. The complexity of Nicolás Maduro's rhetoric. He talks one thing, and an hour after he says the absolute contrary, and he doesn't care. I mean, and Diosdado Cabello, I mean, it's unbelievable, the way they can say one thing and 5 minutes say the next thing. I don't know the sanity of this, the tragedy of this, but it has the society very sick, because I mean, it's like having a parent, that your father, that tells you you're beautiful, and then for the next 5 minutes he says you're so ugly. I mean, it's a dramatic thing for society. Yeah, it's this kind of thing that you don't know where you're going to, and what you are, what's going on. No? And I think that in that capacity, if you have different strategies and different points of views, and I think at the end, the Mesa de Unidad Democrática is an electoral machine. I mean, you can disagree points of views, ideologies, strategies, but at the end of the day, you have to agree when you have to go to elections, because this is a polarized society. So I think they have to work that out in some way, that they recognize the diversity and the disagreements, but that they, when they go to elections, they have to go together. So that's more or less the way it should work. I talked a little bit before about the Civil War. Like I said, I don't have a correct answer about this, but I think we are already in a kind of civil war, because we the citizens don't have anywhere to go to defend our rights. I mean, the judicial is completely controlled. The ombudsman, she said, 2 days ago, something like, of course it's legal that the mayors are in jail. All the powers agree to that. She says that it's legal because of what you were saying. I mean, totalitarianism. Yeah. I mean, so in a way, how do we resolve any problem? How do we defend any civil right? With violence. And so in a way, what we are seeing, not only the 40 deaths on the street protest, but the thousands of deaths every year that we have in the barrios, that tells us that the bands are there, the armed bands, that the social violence is there. So it is kind of the beginning of a civil war there. But having said that, I already said a couple of things, that it is very unequal, because all the arms, the main arms, are in the hands of the military, and the military are quite cohesive around Chavismo right now. The dialogue. Listen, I can't answer that either, because I have to bet on that dialogue. That's the way out. I mean, this is the first time that Maduro has recognized that he has a problem. Last night, Rafael Ramirez said that we had the most successful economy of Venezuela. He said that. I mean, I couldn't believe it. He said that's part of our polarization, that we have two models. We are right now in a very successful economy, and these people say that we are failing our economy. And he said it, and I don't know if he believes that, kind of cynical to say something like that, but he said it, and he said it, why? Because we don't have that much poverty that we had before. We have reduced unemployment, and this and the other thing. He didn't talk about inflation, scarcity, no production, we're importing. No, he talked about the poverty and so on. So, I don't know if I mean, in the first place, you see all the contradictions before they sit down, and you say this is going nowhere. But this is also a way of sitting down. I mean, they have radical bases that they have to attend. So the government can't sit down and say, I'm going to sit down to talk with these parties because I'm civilian, this is a way out, we have to, no, he says, I have to go there to see if I convince them to not be violent. I have to go there to see if I can convince them of socialism. And he insults them, and he has the repression in the streets the same. But you have to say, well, we have to take away this. This is like the trees, and try to go to the center. He has to sit down, showing that he is not giving up anything yet. So I would leave it like that. The dialogue can happen, and for us, it has to happen because that's the way out. It has to happen, and hopefully it will happen with UNASUR that the government trusts and that the opposition is willing to work with. I think the opposition, and I'm going to take what Hector said, I think came out better last night because they showed a diversity. They showed their faces. They had many years that couldn't come out on TV, all of them. And they organized. One talked about economy, the other one talked about medicine. But I don't know, because this is a polarized society. And the other ones were just talking about violence, and you're violent, and you're fascist, and you're this and the other thing. So I don't, it's.
If I may add one word, the role of external actors. This is the first time there are outside actors witnessing this conflict. This is dramatically important.
The OIT, la Organización del Trabajo, how do you say that in English?
ILO, yeah.
They were 2 months ago there, and they sat down with the unions too, and the Attorney General had to go to Geneva to sit down and to talk about human rights. I mean, things are moving. Things are moving. They're going to move slow. As I said before, I'm not sure that Chavism without Chavez can work. I have my doubts about that, in spite of what Cindy has said. Communal councils are receiving, but they're receiving very little, less than they were receiving before. And if the prices of oil don't keep on going up, they will be receiving less and less. And I think that even though they tried to do a patrimonial regime in Venezuela, there is 40 or 50 years of modernity behind that are not completely destroyed. And the people at the end of the day will say, well, listen, we can't be so crazy to go like into the Middle Ages.
Just a final word. I agree that the involvement of UNASUR is very significant, and this is the first time, really, that UNASUR has been called on to play this kind of role, and they therefore have a large stake in having it go well. And I think the particular constellation of governments that will be moderating, now all the foreign ministers are there, but at the core it will be, Ecuador and Brazil, and Colombia, and that those three countries provide sort of guarantees to all sides. And so I think that that's very promising. I think the Brazilian role has changed over the last. There was I think at first Dilma Rousseff's instinct was to rally behind the government as the elected, leader. Not sure it's only because of Odebrecht's involvement. She's got a lot on her plate right now in front of an October presidential election, including reviving the Brazilian economy. But there has been, I think, a change in the Brazilian attitude, a willingness to be more open to the opposition and to play a role. Maria Corina Machado, addressed the legislature, which is quite different and significant, and not what you necessarily would have expected from a PT government. Just very briefly on the role of the United States, and I wish John Feely were still here, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, who left just a moment ago. I agree with the position that Senator Kerry took in terms of saying that the U.S. sanctions and a harder line U.S. policy right now is very counterproductive, is not helpful, allows the regime one more way of unifying its own forces and also other people sympathetic to non-intervention, to kind of rev up this sense of U.S. imperialism and intervention and whatever, so that sanctions and a harder line policy are not the way to go. It is, I think, appropriate for the United States to work very hard behind the scenes with governments, with the government of Colombia, with the government of Brazil, potentially even with the government of Ecuador in trying to push forward and foster the conditions in which dialogue can prosper. And then, and I think that an exchange of ambassadors would be very helpful. The fact that the United States does not have eyes on the ground is not helpful in the current context, and I think that's been important for a long time. And then finally, in response to one of the things that was said earlier about one feature of populism of the 21st century having access to these, this kind of drug money. The populist governments, for all of the lack of transparency that makes it much harder to know what's going on, have no monopoly on this. You look at Mexico and the northern tier of Central America, and even, Peru and to a lesser extent Colombia. I mean, even countries that have made great strides in the fight against drug trafficking, there is still corruption. I mean, there are still lots of drugs that leave the country, sometimes behind the backs of people in the government or the military, and other times, with the connivance or the wink and a nod. So it is a very complicating factor that crime and violence all over the hemisphere has gone up. The penetration of institutions by organized crime is a problem across the region. So I would be very careful about identifying, even though it's gone to an extreme in a case like Venezuela, I would be very careful about identifying the populist governments in the region as somehow being unique in terms of their, confronting this problem. The main difference, obviously, is that there are institutions, or there are institutions that are at least trying to do something about it elsewhere, whereas, the independence of the judiciary has been severely compromised. But again, the penetration is a much broader problem. Please join me in thanking Margarita, Carlos, Hector, and thanks to all of you for hanging in there with us. And you can go out and buy a book. That wouldn't be bad. Thanks.